All right, everybody, we are live again. Dynasty Mir, search for Uhuru, and we have the professor, in fact, the master teacher.
All right, everybody.
Sorry about that. The master teacher, Professor Davis, with us today, and we're going to discuss why has Black America taken the initiative in regards to leading the Pan-African movement. No matter the adversity we faced, whether it be slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, the war on drugs, what was the time? Reconstruction, slavery. Why have we taken the initiative to lead the Pan-African movement and set it off? You know, usually when you speak to a lot of Africans, and we have to have this honest conversation, and we speak on pan-Africanism, usually the excuse is, well, Dynas, the reason why us Africans in our individual countries, the reason why we haven't really reached out is because we have our own problems. You know, we have corrupt governments. We have our own issues. We're trying to get ourselves together as Africans. But Black Americans, no matter the adversity we face, like I just mentioned, we have always made it a priority to reach out to Africa. But as I said before, there really hasn't been it hasn't really been, what's the word I want to use, reciprocated. So, Professor Davis, let's go ahead and get into the subject and go ahead and speak on that.
Well, I think that it's really a complicated answer, but I would probably say that African Americans have always known that their their presence in the United States was problematic by the dominant population. And although we are Americans, we've been in the country for some over 500 years, and we have actually provided America with its primary wealth. Unfortunately, America saw us as problematic. And so, therefore, in essence, for us to kind of survive and thrive as a community, we had to kind of create our own separate institutions. And so, and race, if you will, in the United States was structured in such a way that like, for example, let me just interject and say this, like in the United States and Canada, race was structured on bipolarity. You were either black or you were either white. In Latin America, it was structured on a color continuum. I say all that to say this, that because we were viewed as the other, as blacks, we needed to ensure that, that white America was not going to kind of give us anything. And so therefore we had to kind of create our own. And in doing so, we never, ever forgot the fact that we were black. I'll give you one simple example. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the largest and oldest independent black Protestant denomination in the world with a presence on all six continents. Mm-hmm. I mean, when it talks about the concept of Pan-Africanism, all the things that they were doing in terms of providing a way to escape into Canada through the Underground Railroad, as the A&B Church expanded across the globe, if you will. Some of the places that they arrived, especially in Africa first, were, of course, in the area of Liberia, Sierra Leone, so on and so forth, and even in Southern Africa. But when we went to these places, man, we would build institutions, right, to engage the local African population. And I think that because we were a minority in a sea of whiteness, it gave us this sense of urgency about being black. And Africans on the continent, because they were in the majority, they tended not to see themselves as having to establish their own separate institutions. Although they suffered from oppression and colonialism and so on and so forth, they in some ways had more freedom of movement, more independence. In a sense, African Americans were always under the gun. And what I mean by that, man, I'm going to use the words of of and I've said this in the past, of Dr. Drill Horn at the University of Houston. You know, African Americans have suffered a special type of persecution. I
Correct.
mean, we are strategically located in the most powerful nation on the face of the globe, which really looked at us as being non-citizens, even though we've been here longer than most other people, with the exception of Native Americans. You know, and what I mean by that, most people don't realize that by 1810, 99% of the ancestors of African Americans were already in the United States. So we've been here a long time. And, and because of structural racism, we knew that we were seen as problematic by the dominant society. And so therefore we created all of these separate institutions. As Dr. John Henry Clark would state, he says Black Americans have created more independent Black institutions than any other diasporic population in the world. Not because we were smarter, or not because we necessarily had more money. It's because we had to deal with a specific type of racism within the within the American context. And so therefore, we always knew that we would be seen as the other by the dominant white population. And so therefore, in order for us to survive within the context of America, we had to create something separate. But we didn't forget our African brothers and sisters who, because their experience was not as harsh as Black Americans, you know, and they did not create those types of separate institutions because they did not have to. And I do want to say this, I don't want to leave out the contributions of our Caribbean brothers and sisters who, when many did immigrate to the United States, Marcus Garvey, Stokely Carmichael, and many, many others, man, they actually came and joined hands with us, man, and they were in the fight. Many of them were on the front lines with Black America because they understood that, look, in the Caribbean, Blacks are in the majority. So, you know, racism in some degree is lesser for them because, again, they could kind of get away. Well, African Americans have always been a minority in the U.S. and still are. And so, you know, race was a bit more hostile here. And so we had to. Hello?
Yeah, right here. Right. Hold on. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Was that your phone or what was that?
Are you there?
You there? Yeah, I hear you. You there?
Okay. I'm sorry about that. I was receiving a call. That's what it was.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you just fine. You're good.
Okay. Let me see if I can get back to you because I can hear you, but barely.
Okay.
Hold on one moment.
It might be me. Is that better?
No, I'm actually on my phone and I had an incoming call, and so
yeah, I hear you. I hear you just fine.
It seems as if I can hear you.
Okay.
But it's kind of faint.
Oh, just maybe you want to turn your volume up, maybe.
Okay, I actually have it up as high as possible.
Okay.
But see if I can do this real quickly. Are you still there?
Everybody in the chat room, thank you for joining us. I hear you just fine.
Okay. I'm gonna have to ensure that I listen to you very, very closely.
Okay.
But again, one of the reasons that we're leading the way is because of how we're anchored in America, and we had to kind of create these separate institutions for survival. But at the same time, we always knew that we were connected with Africa, and I think being under duress, if you will, within the United States and in a society which really didn't want us here, but we were Americans, and we are Americans, and so in order for us to kind of, if you will, how do I put it, live any type of quality of life in this country, we had to kind of create something that was separate, and in doing so, we clearly identified with our the land of our ancestors, which is Africa.
Wow. Let me ask you this, kind of just jump ahead a little bit. You had Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, of course, Nana Nkrumah, who were working towards more of a pan-African platform, but of course were either exiled or assassinated. Why?
Say that again.
Okay, so you had Nana Nkrumah,
Right.
Patrice Lumumba,
Sure.
Thomas Sankara, who were working or moving towards a more pan-African agenda, but were either exiled or assassinated. Why post these three leaders hasn't Africa been more, I guess, engaged with a more of a pan-African platform?
That's an easy answer, man. But keep in mind, Dinas, is that that the concept of being African is relatively new. Pan-Africanism emerges in the West, in the United States, in the Caribbean, and not in Africa. Africans, within the last 50, 60 years or so, they're just beginning to see themselves collectively as Africans. This is, for example, if you're from Ghana or from Somalia, yes, it's the African continent, man, but these people are kind of totally different. They're just so different. And so Africans really don't know one another in that same way. They just don't. And so, again, if you look at some of the research by the former president, Robert Mugabe, he did a special, he was at the UN, I believe, a few years back, and he talked about the history of Pan-Africanism, Garvey and Du Bois and Delaney and all these people. And he's saying that it's emerging not in Africa, but amongst Blacks in the diaspora. And that's quite true. Because the African Americans, West Indians, Blacks in South America went through a particular experience. Of course, the history of the Transatlantic, Middle Passage, slave trade, and all of that. And so once we made it to the West, we were viewed collectively as the other by the dominant European colonial powers. That particular mindset is not there with a lot of Africans on the continent, although they were colonized. Mm-hmm. They were colonized, but they didn't go through the history of the Middle Passage, as being seen, if you will, collectively as the other, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so, again, when you look at the history of what we call Pan-Africanism, again, it does not come out of Africa. Alexander Cromwell is African American. Martin Delaney is African American. I'm talking going way back. These are the Blacks who were the descendants of the enslaved folks in the Western world, who created this concept and also had a longing to reconnect to their ancestral past. Now, as I said to you before, I mentioned to you the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Think how radical that is. This old institution, established in the 1700s, and people are calling themselves African Methodist Episcopal. Mm-hmm. Now, how radical is that?
Right.
That's radical. And this is going way back. And this particular institution today has played a pivotal role across the African continent, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. As a matter of fact, man, they played a huge role in the South African liberation movement and also the liberation movement of Namibia. And I could go on about how this particular institution led the way in many respects, man, in terms of freeing up the African continent.
Hmm. Let me ask you this. Let's deal with Marcus Garvey. So a lot of people,
sure,
a lot of people criticize Marcus Garvey. I mean, Marcus Garvey, for the most part, from what we were taught, is the father of Pan-Africanism. From what we've been taught, but a lot of people criticize him for being the father of Pan-Africanism, but not necessarily stepping foot on the continent. What are your thoughts on that? If you could speak.
Right. Yeah. Garvey, without question, basically was responsible for the largest mass movement of Black folks in the world. Brilliant organizer. I mean, an amazing speaker. He was able to kind of communicate to the everyday people. Mm-hmm. But he did make some mistakes along the way, man. You're quite correct, man. He had somewhat of an ego.
Did he really? Because people never really go into.
He did.
Like I didn't know.
Yeah, he he did, but no. But what I'm saying is, I mean, I will say this: Garvey was passionate about the liberation of African people without question. I mean, because he comes from a Maroon background, and you know the history of the Maroons in Jamaica who fought the British and won. And I've actually been to Jamaica, to Maroon Town, some years ago. But Garvey did make some mistakes along the way, and and eventually, of course, he lost his institution, and for any number of reasons, which I won't discuss here. But I think that I'll put it this way: what he was able to do is to capture the hearts and the minds of Black people all over the world, without question, in America, Latin America, all over Africa. The guy was absolutely an amazing, charismatic figure, organizer, speaker, so on and so forth, man. And he was indeed, I guess, probably the most visible Pan-Africanist figure in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and he was the face of Pan-Africanism. And as he, of course, lost his way, Du Bois, of course, took over. But you're right, he did not make it to Africa. Du Bois did, and I'm not quite sure why he did not ever make it to Africa. But what I don't want to do is to take away what he was able to accomplish, which was amazing.
Right.
I mean, Garvey's influence was just absolutely incredible. I mean, someone coming from a small island nation in the Caribbean, man, and to create a mass movement which really transformed the Black world. The guy was incredible. And and in some ways, W.E.B. Du Bois was actually jealous of him, because Du Bois was kind of proper, and he spoke in this, he was kind of an elitist, so to speak.
Right.
And he unfortunately he spoke to folks who were like him. I mean, highly educated, trained, and and he could never really kind of, how do I say this, relate to the everyday Black person. That was just not him. I mean, he was reared in a integrated society, and my God, man, in Massachusetts. His grandfather, his great grandfather was white, a famous doctor from Poughkeepsie, New York, and so his particular whole narrative was somewhat distinct from Garvey. And like I said, Garvey was someone who could speak to the common man and actually captivate their attention. But again, he did make some mistakes along the way, and one of them, of course, is meeting with the Klan, and I'm sure you're aware of that.
Who met with the Klan? The boy?
No, Marcus Garvey.
Why did he meet with the Klan for?
Well, Garvey believed in the in the separate but equal case, and I think that and this is just my own personal view.
Go ahead.
Garvey, I don't think he quite understood the complexity of Black life for African Americans. Garvey was from Jamaica,
right,
and he was an immigrant to the United States, and he could always leave, right, America and go home. African Americans are here, and there was no place for us to go. And so I think that when he did this, man, it sent, my God, man, like the Black leadership took issue with him meeting with the Klan. I mean, it was extremely problematic. A. Philip Randolph and Monroe Charter and Du Bois and others really just were, up in arms about him, having this meeting with the Klan, which was really problematic. And so I think after that and some other things, that was a part of his demise. But with that said, Ben, an amazing figure who should be studied, not only in Jamaican history, but world history, because he really transformed, I guess, a lot of the lives of not only African Americans, but Blacks in the Caribbean, Africa, and beyond. I mean, he was definitely a hero, without question, man.
All right. So someone in the chat room, we got a couple questions in the chat room. First question. What do you think about bourgeoisie like Du Bois sabotaging Marcus Garvey?
Well, and again, I think Du Bois, keep in mind, lived 95 years. And early on in his career, man, I think he also made some mistakes along the way because he really, I think he suffered from the fact that he was multiracial, and he had to go through a process of really coming into his blackness. And so early on, Du Bois in some ways, man, was actually envious of Garvey. I mean, imagine this guy, man, a little short, dark-skinned Jamaican, an immigrant, coming to the United States, man, and he's able to kind of, as I say, captivate people in a way that Du Bois could never do. I mean, yes, Du Bois was probably the most brilliant African American of his time, or a brilliant black person. Du Bois was absolutely brilliant, but he was stuffy. He was an elitist, and I mean, put it to you this way, Dinas. I mean, Du Bois would probably not be hanging out with, let's just say, oh God, man, the average black person on the corner. Okay. I mean, I'm not gonna no, I'm not gonna do that. But what I'm saying is that he was an elitist.
Right.
Marcus Garvey, you could see Garvey hanging out with someone on the corner. I mean, he was just a different type. And so again, man, he related to the common person. Du Bois did not. And so I think he grew to admire Marcus Garvey in his older age. But early on, and keep in mind, he was from the elite, light complected, and all of that. That was an issue back in the day in the early part of America, and also too in parts of the West Indies. Keep in mind too, man, that
huge in the West Indies.
Keep in mind that Garvey was problematic for Jamaicans, especially the mulatto elite in Jamaica, and also too, man, that the UNIA could have never worked in Jamaica. I mean, people often, you should ask some of your friends, why was the UNIA headquartered in the United States and not in the Caribbean, not in South America, not in Europe? And I'll tell you why.
Tell us why.
Even Garvey said this. Garvey had traveled throughout Europe and Latin America, wherever there was a black population. And Garvey came to the U.S. in March of I believe 1916, and Garvey said that this is the most sophisticated black population on the planet, and he's talking about blacks in the United States. And he knew that Africa, and he knew that he had a message that would resonate with the average black American who was marginalized due to white supremacy. I mean, it was ripe, it was ripe for the pickings. And so, because you had a large population of black folks here, that he would be able to organize and form the UNIA. And I often told you before, man, that the UNIA was not an anomaly at all. The UNIA is a replica of the Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model, because Garvey reached out to Washington in beginning in 1912, and he told Washington, "Hey, listen, I want to create something in Jamaica which is similar to the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama." And and as a result of corresponding with Washington from 1912 until Washington's death in 1915. He would organize what is now the UNIA, and if you read Garvey's writing, he'll tell you that one of the most influential books that he's ever read was Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. And if you look at the Booker T. Washington papers, which they're 15 volumes, and each volume is roughly 300 to 500 pages, you'll see all of the correspondences between Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington. So there's a lot of history there.
All right. So the next question is really a statement. I want you to address this. Oh, see, I don't understand where you're coming from, but we'll have Professor Davis package it. He says, let's make it clear. African Americans started pan-Africanism not because they were more oppressed than the Africans. I disagree with that, but because they were allowed to speak out after slavery. Can you package that? I really don't. I mean, Yeah, but go ahead.
And again, you have to imagine a population of African people away from home, right? In a white majority society, which does not want them at all. And you're seen as the other. You know, you're not seen as American, and you are. And so, in order for this Black population to reconnect in some way, man, they had to create a separate identity that was connected to their roots, which is Africa. African Americans are Africans. They're Africans in the United States, and so they knew, for example, that America would never ever see them as full citizens, ever. And so they had to create, and so they thought to themselves, you know what, let's connect in some ways back to our ancestral roots. And I'm going to say this again, as I mentioned to you before, with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is one of the largest and oldest Black institutions actually in the United States. And it's not just about religion, it's about so many different other things. But again, they when you look at the writings of, as I said earlier, of Oliver Cromwell and Martin Delany and so on and so forth, you know, they're all talking about this collective African identity. They're all talking about Africa. They are reimagining what Africa could be, just like Wakanda, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And so this is a part of it, because you have this population of people that's away from home, that know that they're not European, right? For the most part, that you are African. Now, Africans on the continent, man, again, if you're from, let's just say, what is now Nigeria, and you're Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, etc., you tend not to see yourselves collectively as African. You see yourself as those ethnic groups, because everyone in Nigeria is Black for the most part.
Correct.
And that's just not the case for a marginal population in America that has gone through, you know what? I tell people all the time that African Americans have lived in the United States for over 500 years. And there's no other population that has had to endure some 450 years of terror, 250 years of being enslaved, 100 years of Jim Crow, decades of bad public policy decisions which are disruptive to healthy Black family development, and also the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. And so you have a segment of Americans who are just being completely marginalized and oppressed and discriminated against by the dominant white society. And so and you're not viewed as being American white just because you are of African ancestry. And so therefore you have to kind of create a separate identity, even though you are an American. You are as American as anyone else. But unfortunately, the dominant population sees you as something else. And one of the reasons why they do is because you have a history of being chattel. You were the property. I mean, you were the folks who were used to build the primary wealth of the United States, and to a lesser extent, Canada. And so again, this group of people have to kind of create something, or reimagine their homeland. And so they, and so this concept of establishing, if you will, a collective African identity emerges out of that. And the beautiful thing about African Americans is this, man, most people don't realize is that our ancestral background ranges from people as far north as what is now Mauritania, all the way through West Africa, through the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Angola, Mozambique, and through Madagascar. Now, I'm originally from the state of Virginia, and there are many, many, many African Americans whose ancestors are the descendants of slaves that were brought from Madagascar, because in the early 1700s, Madagascar slaves were prized in the Tidewater area of Virginia and also parts of New York. And to add to that mix of the African American makeup is roughly 25 to 30% European and or Native American. And so in some ways, we are brand new people. But going back to...
No, finish your point. Finish your point. No. Finish your point. Then I ask a question. Finish your point.
But the point of the matter in terms of Pan-Africanism, we just never forgot who we were. We never ever forgot the fact that we are of African descent. Now, some of my Africans and some of my Caribbean friends get on me and say, "Well, Professor Davis, you know what? You African Americans, you're Afro Saxons. You're just as as white Americans." Well, and I explain to them, here's the difference between, let's just say, the Caribbean population and African Americans. You must keep in mind that the vast majority of slaves that were brought to the West Indies and South America, those slaves were African born, meaning that they were able to hold on to certain cultural to certain cultural norms. Well, in the United States, by 1825, the overwhelming majority of Black Americans were already fourth, fifth, sixth generation American, far removed from African culture. In essence, we were American born. As a matter of fact, as I said earlier, between 1800, 1810, 1815, 99.7% of the ancestors of African Americans were already in the United States. And again, we are fundamentally Americans. The Caribbean folks, well, if you go to Jamaica, Haiti, and some of the other islands, you can still see remnants of African culture because, again, those folks were able to hold on to some of their cultural roots. And in addition, it was demographics. The bullseye of the transatlantic slave trade was the Caribbean region. 5.5 million slaves went to the Caribbean, or roughly 42% of all the slaves. 38% of the slaves went to Brazil. 17% went to Spanish America. Only 4 to 5% of the slaves came to the United States and Canada. You're talking 450,000. That's it. That's it. However, our survival rate was better, a lot better than the Africans who landed in Latin America.
Wow. Wow. Somebody had brought up another. Oh, okay. Are you familiar with Edward Wilmot Blyden?
Yes. He was from the West Indies. He was from, I think, either St. Vincent, St. Croix, one of the American Virgin Islands.
Okay.
And he also migrated to. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, they were saying he also, I guess, was he might have had more, I guess, earlier Pan-African ideas than Marcus Garvey.
Well,
true or?
Absolutely. No. And what I don't want to do is to minimize the huge role that West Indians played in in the early emergence of Pan-Africanism. Without absolutely, Blyden, as a matter of fact, ended up in the he actually migrated to Liberia, and Blyden actually played a huge role at the University of Liberia early on. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, he was no question a forerunner in terms of the Pan-African movement. Absolutely.
Mm. All right, let's see here. What other questions do we have? Okay. This is the question I had, and this is a little bit off topic. Sure. I don't know if you're familiar with the movement that I'm not African, I'm indigenous. I was here before. Real quick, if we could touch on that just a little bit. What are your thoughts on that? I'm not African. I'm a Hebrew Israelite.
Well, look, man,
how do you feel about that?
Let me just. Okay, there's something that's called the Transatlantic Slave Database, right? And you can actually access it online. We clearly know, man. And also, if you go to the Schomburg Center in New York or the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we clearly have records, man, of the name of these ships, the times that they came back and forth across the African continent to the Americas. The vast majority of Black folks in the Americas are the result of the transatlantic slave trade. That's just a fact. It's an ugly part of world history, but this is the fact. Now, most people don't realize this, man, and this is an awful thing to say. Quick question to you, just a brief trivia question.
Go ahead.
How many voyages do you think were made? How many voyages do you think were made back and forth across the Atlantic bringing African slaves? Take a guess.
I would say at least 30,000.
Dinah says that's an excellent guess. Between 35 and 40,000 voyages were made. for over 400 years, bringing Africans, from the continent to the New World, which is really, if you actually step back and think about that, that's absolutely crazy that this particular institution lasted so long. I mean, honestly, think about this, man. Walter Rodney, the great Guyanese historian, basically talks in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He talks about how the transatlantic slave trade had a direct impact on the development or the underdevelopment of Africa. Because here's an interesting point again. I'm going to give you an example of the differences between slavery in Latin America, the Caribbean, and in the United States. As I stated earlier, 95% of all the slaves went to Latin America.
Right.
Two-thirds of this.
To Brazil in particular, correct?
Well, again, Brazil received 5 million. The Caribbean received 5.5 million. And Spanish America received roughly 3 million. The U.S. and Canada, 450,000. That's it. Okay. But here's the difference, man, in Latin America. 2/3 of the slaves in Latin America were men, 1/3 women. In the United States, it was 50-50. So they brought an equal number of men to the United States and an equal number of women. Mm-hmm. And so, and for that reason too, American-born slaves, if you will, were able to have more children. As a matter of fact, the average Southern woman in the United States had 10 children, compared to 4 for women in Latin America. So it was big business. It was, and again, it really stunted the growth of the African continent.
Mm. We have a lot of people who are not big fans of Du Bois. I see in the chat room.
Well, and again, man, Du Bois, as I said before, man, he had to grow. And I've been to Ghana, and there's a Du Bois Center in downtown Accra, and I'm sure you've been there as well too.
You know what? I didn't visit I've been to Ghana, been to Accra, but I did not visit the Du Bois Center. But when I go next year, I'll visit.
Right, and again, man, keep in mind, again, Du Bois was from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which was a socialist community, which was integrated. I mean, it was a predominantly white early setup, and so he was mixed. Again, his great grandfather, James Du Bois, was the descendant of a French Huguenot, and the French Huguenots came to the United States, man, in the early 1600s. James Du Bois, his great grandfather was a famous, wealthy a doctor, man, in Poughkeepsie, New York. And as a matter of fact, man, during the American Revolution, he was loyal to the British throne. He left America, right? Migrates to the to the Bahamas and to Long Key Island there, where he marries a slave woman in the Bahamas, has 4 or 5 children. One, of course, is Du Bois's grandfather, Alexander. He comes back to the States, and Alexander marries, has a son early on, Alfred, who was born in Haiti, and he comes back from Haiti to the U.S. and marries Du Bois's mother. But my point in saying all this, man, his racial makeup is somewhat distinct from that of Marcus Garvey, because Marcus Garvey was just black, and Du Bois was, although a black person, he was the product of the American experience, and he had to kind of evolve into his blackness, and he did. Over time, he came to admire what Marcus Garvey was doing. But early on, man, again, his entire early background was extremely different. So,
what the African Union?
Yes.
Do you think the African Union is doing enough to really engage the diaspora?
Okay, the African Union is actually organized in 6 regions, and the 6th region is the Black diaspora, right? So the Black diaspora is recognized. Your question is, are they doing enough now? Is that your question?
Yeah. What are they doing? Like, are they doing enough? What's the role? Because I just think as a Black American who's passionate about the diaspora, about Africa, I feel as if the African Union is not engaged enough or engaged at all with the diaspora, even though, from my understanding, and they've had it before, they've had it for a while, there's a representative of America who sits in Ethiopia, and I think there's one here as well, an ambassador, an American ambassador
Right.
to the union. But I mean, what are they doing?
Right. And I think that what helps Dynas is to really be engaged in some of the institutions that are actually on the front line. You and I have talked quite a few times offline in regards to the Constituency for Africa, which is Melvin Foot's organization. And he's on the front lines in terms of what's going on the African continent. And I will say this: there's a lot going on, but if you're not a part of these major institutions, it's kind of hard to see it. Like I say, man, I've sent you several videos of what the Africa America Institute has done, is doing across the continent, all 54 countries. I think I mentioned to you before with Melvin Foot, who developed the Constituency for Africa 25, 30 years ago. He established YALI, which is Young African Leadership Initiative. And this particular program takes African students from all over the continent and brings them to the U.S. and pair them at universities so they can develop the leadership skills, networking skills, and also learn how to go back and and grow their particular country. You are familiar with Africare, right?
I'm not. No.
Right. Another African American led organization which has a presence in roughly 40 countries. This institution really deals with Africa at the grassroots, building hospitals, clinics. They work with economic development across the African continent and these types of things. And so all three of these African American led institutions that I mentioned to you, man, are heavily engaged with the African Union. And so the Africans at the leadership level are all very aware of these organizations and the outstanding work that they're doing, man. So to answer your question, are things happening? A lot of things are happening, man. A whole lot of things. And
are we privy to any can you tell us what's happening, or is that a secret?
Well, no. I mean, what specifically are you looking to?
Let me ask you, what benefits do Black Americans have access to because of the African Union that's measurable? Like, as a Black American who's passionate about pan-Africanism, who's passionate about the diaspora, what can I point to or say the African Union has done blank, fill in the blank for us, that we can appreciate or benefit from?
Okay. Now I understand your question. Okay, all right. Like for example, now, would you agree that that maybe when you and I spoke a couple of months ago, that you were not aware of the institution that I call now, and just to kind of follow me here because I'm going someplace.
Go ahead.
You were unaware of the legacy of the Africa American Institute, right?
I wasn't, but I am now. But I'm trying to figure out how you're going to tie that into the African Union.
You'll see.
Okay, go ahead.
You'll see. And you would agree by looking at their what they've been able to do, that there are measurable results across the continent, right?
Okay, there were measurable results for Africans. What about Black?
Right. So my point with so when it comes to what the African Union is doing for African Americans, I will say this: Strive Masiawa, who is one of the he has a program in place, man, for Americans, African Americans. Well, it's, you know, and I'll send this information to you.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I think I did send this to you for Black Americans who were to go over and actually do business in Africa for roughly 6 months to a year.
Send it now again, or send it so I could put it in the chat, or send it whenever you get a chance so I can put it in the chat.
Sure. And as a matter of fact, I think I sent that to you. And so
Okay,
let me just say this, man.
Go ahead.
Let me just say this. Africa, unfortunately, man, because most of these nations are relatively, they've only been independent for the last, oh my God, and some of them maybe 40, 50, 60 years. I mean, in terms of South Sudan, the last few years, they've yet to develop, let's just say, man, strong enough institutions that can really help the Black diaspora, i.e. African Americans, Blacks in Brazil, so on and so forth. They just unfortunately don't have those institutions in place. They don't. And I think that you know, one of the reasons why African Americans are leading the way, we have long-standing institutions. I mean, you're talking about, and I mentioned to you the AME not for the purpose of religion, but for the purpose of establishing institutions across the African continent. They've been doing it for over 100 years. But these are long-standing African American institutions, and unfortunately, man, when organizations like the AME and the African American Institute were actually doing the groundwork, many of these African nations were still colonized, and so unfortunately, there are just so many pressing issues on the African continent, man. And I'm just going to say it, that the Black diaspora, African Americans, are not really a priority at this time.
Okay. Okay, let me ask you, are you familiar with Paul Kagame? Did I pronounce his name right? The president of Rwanda? All right, now, and I've heard it from other people as well, are blaming him for a lot of the, I guess, instability of the Congo. And they're saying that since he's head of the AU now, that the AU cannot move properly, I guess, because of his rule. I mean, the West, they love Paul. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, if you know at all?
You know, honestly, I don't know. I know who Paul Kagame is, but I don't know enough about the topic to really give you a definitive answer. Unfortunately, I just don't know.
Okay, and then O'Shea Duke Jackson says that we shouldn't be a priority. We are not bringing any money to the continent. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh my God, absolutely not true.
Go ahead.
That's just absolutely not true at all, man. And you know, and again, man, I think that you know, either he is not engaged with these organizations, man, that are just doing a lot of good on the African continent, man, a lot of good. And so, like I say, I've named the Africa American Institute, I've named AfriCare, I've named the Constituency for Africa. I can go on and on and on and on and on about all of these African American led organizations, man, that have been able to kind of transform Africa. Now, you are familiar with ACON, right?
Of course.
ACON was here just this past week, man, in Washington, D.C. He met with Melvin Foote. And Melvin Foote is the president for the Constituency for Africa, man. And they met him at the Africa House. And they were discussing some of the things that the Black diaspora and Africans can do, man, to work together in unison. And again, did you take a look at the information that I sent to you in regards to Yali?
Yeah, who was that again? I think I did, but who?
No, it's, you know, it stands for the Young African Leadership Initiative. It's basically.
I did, yes.
Right, we're creating a pathway for the next generation of young African leaders, which is huge. And I'm telling you, man, this is something that, you know, that because within the next 20 years, man, Africa is going through a metamorphosis. And think about this, man. African American led institutions have been in the forefront in terms of these changes. I think I mentioned to you in the past, Mr. Strive Masiawa, right?
Yes.
He's the gentleman who is the he's the gentleman who's the founder
of EcoNet, correct?
Right, right. And as I mentioned to you before, man, he's now a billionaire, right?
Correct.
And he was recruited by Andrew Young and Dr. Lewis Sullivan as a young man in Zimbabwe. And now this guy has actually has given millions of dollars to help Africans in startups across the continent. And so these are the types of things, but unfortunately, if your listeners are not engaged, see, I'm associated with the Africa American Institute, and so I know what they're doing.
Okay.
And these organizations that I'm listening to you, so I know that these organizations are doing outstanding work, man, in terms of transforming the African continent. And the reason that they're doing it is because, again, African Americans are a huge population, some 50 million or so. We are strategically located in the most powerful nation on the face of the globe. We have access to resources, and so therefore, man, we have too much is given, much is required, and so therefore, man, we're in a position to really move the continent forward more so than they can do for us. And so again, most of these countries have only been independent for 40, 50, 60 years. And so they're still getting their bearings. And they're not really in a position to assist the diaspora, man, in a real way. And that's that's just the reality of it. Of what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so O'Shea says what you're saying. So this question is kind of twofold. O'Shea is saying what you're saying sounds good, but we all know the real. If blacks don't buy their way back into the continent, they will not have any pull. And then part two of that question is, where is it? People want to know specifically, and we've discussed this before, but you're probably going to have to give them the resume again of what African Americans have actually built on the continent of Africa.
Well, as I told you before, man, that Ethiopian Airlines is the oldest and largest airlines and the most prosperous airline and technologically advanced airlines on the African continent. It was built by Black Americans in 1945. Ethiopian Airlines serves as the hub for training all African pilots on the continent. Now that's huge. I mean, think about this, man. That's actually huge. That's one small example of how African Americans have engaged and used their technologically prowess to go back to the continent and to help transform the African continent. That's one example.
Okay.
Now we've also utilized our HBCUs. Nnamdi Azikiwe, first president of Nigeria, graduates from Lincoln University. Kwame Nkrumah graduates from an HBCU. Hastings Banda graduates from an HBCU. The current president of Namibia graduates from an HBCU. Are you aware, again, that many of the early pioneers, man, of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, man, attended? You've heard of Wilberforce University, right?
Of course.
It's a historic African American university. It's a historical African American university. There has been a wing of Wilberforce University in South Africa since 1908. Since 1908. And so these are examples, man. These are some of the few examples, and there's a lot more, man, of how, again, African Americans have engaged the continent.
Somebody made a great point in the chat room. So Ethiopian Airlines is state-owned. Why haven't they given credit to African Americans who assisted them?
Oh, they have. Oh, absolutely, they have. If you go to downtown Addis Ababa, there's a huge statue of Colonel John Charles Robinson. Do you know the history of Colonel Robinson, by the way?
Yeah. You shared it with us, but please go ahead. But I don't know.
Sure.
He fought in World War II, right, or World War I?
Well, here's the thing. Haile Selassie's cousin, Malcolm Bayam, was here at Howard University studying to become a medical doctor in 1921-22. And Malcolm Bayam said to Haile Selassie, hey, I know an American who can help us. This was during World War II here, and Ethiopia was actually being attacked by the Italians. And so Malcolm Bayam, reached out to Colonel John Charles Robinson, and he said that, listen, Ethiopia needs your help. And so Colonel Robinson says, sure, I'll help. And so he received a telegram from Haile Selassie asking him to come to Ethiopia. So Colonel Robinson actually goes to Ethiopia in the 1930s. Haile Selassie makes him the commander over the entire Ethiopian Air Force. And basically, with the help of Colonel Robinson and the Allied powers, the Ethiopians were able to defeat the Italians. Colonel Robinson comes back to the United States, right? He opens an airline outside of Chicago for all races of people. And as a matter of fact, man, interesting enough, the first pilots to graduate from that airline that the airport that he had created outside of Chicago were actually Chinese immigrants. But that's neither here nor there. But anyway, Robinson decides to go back to Ethiopia at the request of Haile Selassie in 1944, and he says, "Hey, listen, we need an airline." And so Colonel Robinson goes back with a dozen or so Tuskegee Airmen. In 44, he establishes Sultan Airlines, which turns into East African Airlines. And in 1945, East African Airlines becomes Ethiopian Airlines. And again, if you go to downtown Addis Ababa, there's a huge statue of Colonel John Charles Robinson right downtown. And so the Ethiopians the older Ethiopians will recognize it. The younger generation probably will not know.
Okay. All right, let's see here. Let's see if we got any more questions in the chat room. I hope this is helping everybody, that you guys are finding the value in this. Let's see what else we got here in the chat room. But yeah, but like I told you offline, Professor Davis, a lot of people don't. Oh, here we go. Now, people who are interested in getting in touch or being a part of the AAI, how does that process work?
Okay, great. It is an institution that's based out of New York City, and what I will do is once at the close of the show, I will provide a link where people can actually call and to and to engage the leadership. Interesting enough, man, the current president of the Africa America Institute is from Ghana. His name is Kofi Aponting. And he's doing outstanding work. As a matter of fact, man, Ghana is going to be the fastest growing economy in the world in 2019. It's on track to grow at 8.3% a year, and so a lot of African countries have been assisted by the legacy. And the work of the Africa America Institute, man. I mean, it's huge. And just to give you a bit of information, this African American created institution was actually founded in 1953 by two African American professors. The first one was Dr. Horace Bond, who was the father of Julian Bond. He was the president of Lincoln University at that time. And also the second professor was Dr. William Leo Hasbury, who was the founder of African Studies at Howard University circa 1920, 21, 22. Both these gentlemen got together. They felt the need for an organization or institution to assist Africans as they emerged from their colonial past. And as a matter of fact, man, as you know, Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to receive its independence in 1957, and the Africa America Institute was there, man, in terms of helping Ghanaians in their educational development.
This might be a little off topic. Someone's asking, can you if you could answer the question of how abolitionists like John Brown and the Quakers had on what impact did they have on African American history? The slave abolishers, abolishers. Is that the correct term? Is that how you say it?
You talking about the abolitionists?
Abolitionists. I'm sorry, abolitionists. Well, I butchered that. Abolitionists.
Sure. Yeah. No worry. Let me just say, man, that there has been a segment of white Americans who have always known that the institution of slavery was unjust, and so they put their lives on the line, man, to assist marginal populations, i.e., African Americans, some Native Americans, and John Brown was simply one of those people. Mm-hmm. He understood that that we could not have a society where a large segment of our population did not have access to resources, and so therefore, man, he spoke out. He not only spoke out against this injustice, but he did something. He lost his life because of that. And so it's just that simple. Hmm. And right. And let me just say, and this race thing is, this is completely off the subject, but it's really artificial, man. I think that race, as you know, man, is a social construction, and what science is determining is not race, but rather population variability, which is saying that certain groups of people share a common biohistory and a common biogeography. However, we do suffer from the concept. We do suffer from the effects of the concept of race, and so I just thought that I'd say that.
Mm. So present day, we'll take groups like the Black Caucus, who just renounced. Some of them are renounced Louis Farrakhan, which I completely disagree with. I love Louis Farrakhan. What is the Black Caucus doing, or the Black members of the DNC doing to engage Africa?
And let me just say this, and Minister Farrakhan is a very, very controversial figure, and as you probably well know, Dr. John Henrik Clarke didn't
like Farrakhan, yeah,
have a lot.
Yeah,
and so look, wow, Louis Farrakhan. Let me just say this. I honestly think it's important, man, that that whatever your political leanings or your social leanings, that if you're not bringing anything to the table that's going to improve the lives and condition of Black people or people, period, man, then just kind of don't get in the way.
Okay.
And so the Congressional Black Caucus. I honestly sometimes think that they really need to hear from the American people, from African Americans. They need to actually have more town halls and see the needs of African Americans. I oftentimes think that members of the caucus are comfortable, right? And they don't take enough time out, man, to really do things that impact the everyday citizen. Mm-hmm. And so they should be criticized without question. These are elected officials,
right?
And they shouldn't be given a pass. They should not be given a pass at all, man. They should be working for us. They were elected by us, the citizens, and they should be serving us, man, in a real way to improve the conditions.
How do you feel about? Are you familiar with Umar Johnson, the Prince of Pan-Africanism? How do you feel about him being the Prince of Pan-Africanism? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, sometimes we can be our own worst enemy and be a distraction. Let me just say, oh wow. My God, that's a dissertation, and I don't give a whole lot of credence and time to what he says at all, man. I think he's a quite sharp young man. Mm-hmm. He has some interesting points of views, and but I often think that you know, I don't necessarily think that he's the best choice in terms of, in terms of actually, if you will, speaking for the needs of African Americans, or speaking to the needs of Black people.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think he's the best choice.
Okay. Okay. All right. I mean, I guess, like you said, that's another. I mean, because I like Umar. I like Umar. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm just saying from a Pan-African aspect. What are your thoughts on him saying he's the principal?
Right. And oftentimes too, back to Pan-Africanism, I think that we need to keep in mind that that history is extremely important, and I think that that Africans on the continent, man, are just beginning to kind of really come into their own in terms of what Pan-African is, because again, man, this is relatively new for continental Africans, because I think that one of the biggest problem that Africans have is, if you will, tribalism,
right,
or ethnic division. Because again, I guess that the blessing in some ways for Black Americans, we see ourselves collectively as one single people, which is a good thing. And and if you go to, like I say, Nigeria, or even in Ethiopia, which is about to kind of explode with the Amharas and the Tigres and the Oromos, etc., most African Americans don't have to worry about that, because you can be from Atlanta or LA. It doesn't really matter. You're just a Black American.
Right.
And we don't see ourselves as, you may have a Southern accent from Texas, or a New York accent. You're still an African American. I mean, it's not that different. And I think that collectively as a group, the culture is more or less the same. And
right.
For continental Africans, it's just not at all. I mean, you could go 50 miles in Nigeria and speak a completely different language, and possibly have a different religion.
Mm. Okay. What let's see, what else do we have here? So, I mean, as Black Americans, what should we do or continue to do to, I guess, I don't want to necessarily say press, because that kind of sounds like force, or I guess continue the Pan-African.
The engagement is real. Let me just say, man, again, I think, if you're not, I think what happens, Dinas, is that a lot of people aren't engaged in these organizations or institutions that I've listed. But so many positive things are happening, man. I mean, in like I said to you before, man, AAI has programs in all 54 African countries.
Mm-hmm.
All 54. They're on the ground in all 54 African countries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who's who is engaged? I mean, Dengati, who was the richest Black person in the world from Nigeria, received an award from AAI back in, I think it was 2016. Strive Masiawa received an award from AAI back in, I think the year before that. The president of Ghana just received an award, and it just goes on and on and on. And so what I'm saying to you is that people are engaged, and these things are happening. I mean, a lot of positive things are happening. So and so I think that if you're outside and not really plugged in, you think, well, nothing's going on. But there's a whole lot that's going on. And I actually see a lot of it.
And someone in the chat room, I'm guessing the brother from Africa, he says African Americans should make known to Africans how much they are doing in Africa. their efforts are hidden from the
Oh,
continent, which
oh, sure.
we've talked about before, Professor Davis. It seems like it's all of everything that we contribute to the continent goes unknown, to the point where when I go to the slave dungeons as a descendant of the slave trade to visit, I got to pay to enter. Tourist price. You know, that's how I
Right.
feel like
Well,
we're not acknowledged here,
well,
you know.
well, and you know, and the truth of the matter, man, is this: is that, you know, look, we are Americans, and I think that Africans see us as, yes, we're black, but we are Americans. I think that Africa, and I've been to several countries in Africa, they see us as Americans first, right? And so, I mean, and they know that America is the wealthiest nation on the globe.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, they know if you're coming 5, 6 thousand miles across the ocean, you know, to Africa, you have money.
Right.
And so, and it's business. I get it, but the gentleman who asked the question, I agree, man, and I think that people don't know the legacy or the huge contribution of African American engagement across the country. I mean, think about this, man, and people say it was a failure, and you had a guest on your show who was a Liberian American who talked at length about Liberia. And think about this, man, that here it is, formerly enslaved African Americans, man, created a brand new country called Liberia. And
Right.
formerly enslaved African Canadians really laid the foundation for Sierra Leone, which is pretty amazing. I mean, you know, if let me just say this: if uh, President Tolbert in Liberia was able to have been able to ensure there was no well, if he was able to control the ethnic strife in Liberia between the Gio and the Krom people of Liberia, you know, and there was no civil war. Do you know that Liberia would probably be one of the wealthiest nations in Africa, or wealthiest nations? It would have in the 1970s. It had a GDP that was equal to that of Japan. In the 1970s, according to the UN, it was a firmly established middle income nation. But the civil war between the tribes, the Gio and the Krom people, were helped to destroy this pan-African nation. Because Liberia, for example, man, really helped to lay the foundation of the African Union.
Mm.
And that's true. There's a book written by, oh God, there's a book written by, I believe it was Nnamdi Azikiwe, who talks about that. And he was, again, he was the first president of Liberia, first president of Nigeria. And he talks about the legacy that Liberia left for all of Africa. Because at one point in time, Liberia really was the land of opportunity for African immigrants who were coming from all over the place. I mean, it served as a place of refuge for Nelson Mandela and so many others. But anyway, I don't want to get off the topic of what I'm talking about. But you're right, man. My book talks about and provides more information in regards to what Black Americans have actually done, man, on the African continent and are doing on the African continent. And I give you this example too, man. I told you that Namibia received its independence March of 1990, and that the African Methodist Episcopal Church, man, really played the major role in helping the early Namibians organize, and to fight off the colonialists. For example, many of the first elected officials in Namibia, man, were members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, not as just a religion, but for organizing. And again, this institution, man, has been around since the 1700s. I think all.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead and finish it, and I'm gonna ask two more questions. Then we'll close out.
Yeah, I think people often forget that that Black Americans, because of racism within the American context, had to create a separate parallel world in the United States, because white America just, how do I say this? They had a difficult time. Uh, these were the former slaves, and so increasingly when African Americans got their freedom, in some of them, as early as the 1830s, 40s, and even earlier than that, man. Yes, whites saw us as, okay, they're free, but they're not equal to us. and so and so these people have got to go. I mean, they are competing with me. They were competing with poor whites and incoming immigrants, and so African Americans says, okay, you know what? We're not going to get fairness in this country, so let's create a separate parallel world within the context of the United States. And so therefore, this is why you have all of these institutions that were established by Black Americans, the Black church, Black banks, and so on and so forth, because you had to, because of the type of racism that they were dealing with in the United States. And so, but anyway, you were about to ask a question.
Yeah. So two more questions. So the first question is, let me go back to it. Are you familiar with the new president of Ghana, Nana Addo?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. So he asked the USA not to neglect Africa while telling the West that Africa needs to stop depending on aid. How do you feel about is he contradicting himself? Like, what are your thoughts on that comment?
Well, he was honored by, I think I sent this to you. Well, he was honored by the Africa American Institute, right? Mm-hmm. He received this huge award from them. And as a matter of fact, man, as I mentioned to you before, Ben, that the current president of the Africa American Institute is also Ghanaian. And his name is Kofi Apintang. And so he is working very closely with the current Ghanaian president. Look, I think what the Ghanaian president is saying, he's speaking to the West, and he's also speaking to his own people, right? And he's saying, look, we've been independent since 1957. It's really time for us to kind of take control of our own destiny, right? And and to ensure, that enough is enough in terms of aid. There has got to come a time where Ghanaians are able to kind of stand on their own 2 feet and say, look, we need to kind of take the bull by the horns and be responsible for our own destiny. And that's actually how I see it.
Now, doesn't the West, for the most part, fund or play a role in the African Union and a lot of these institutions? Is that true or false?
Well, unfortunately, here's an issue. African leadership is problematic in the sense that there are not enough Africans who are saying, you know what, there are not enough African leaders who are being responsible, man. And they're still taking aid from the Chinese, from the West, and they're neglecting their own citizens. With that said, I do think, man, that there is coming a new crop of leaders who are going to challenge the folks who are in power now, man. And slowly but surely, they're going to begin to transform the continent, man, and to create the type of Africa that they want to see for the future generations of young people. But to answer your question, yes, there are far too many Africans who are still taking aid from developed countries.
All right, and then this is the last question. So you have a lot of well, not a lot, but many Black Americans saying, in fact, let me, Mr. Professor Davis, what is the future for the Black American here in America? Because many are speaking about leaving America and relocating to Africa. Do you think that's a smart idea? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Or what are your thoughts in regards to the future? Because people, they speak on the economy crashing. If America falls apart or it's gonna fall apart, what are they gonna do? The dollar disappears, and the bank, the doom and gloom, and how Black Americans are gonna get caught in that. And then also Dr. Martin Luther King said he regrets integrating into a burning house. So we all should go back to Africa where there's a better life. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know what, and that's I think that you're going to have multiple strands of African Americans look, and you and I have talked about the black elites who are not look. Whatever happens to the United States, there's a segment of the African American population that's going to be fine. Because these folks have old black American money going back 200 years. Look, I think increasingly you're going to find African Americans who will move to Africa or to other parts of the world because it's a way that they can actually live a better quality of life, a lot less stress than what's going on in contemporary America. If you're talking about the mass migration of 50 plus million people across the African continent, I don't think that's I don't think that's going to happen right away. Now, maybe 40, 50 years from now, when you have a huge number of African Americans, man, who are making more money, and where Africa is in a place to kind of absorb the black diaspora, that may happen. Mm-hmm. That may happen, man. I'm serious. And so we're actually moving in the right direction with institutions like AAI, the Constituency for Africa, Africare, where you're seeing these African American institutions engage Africa, man, in a constructive way, man. It's going to happen because Africa really is the future. One of the most beautiful things that, again, Dr. Bond and Dr. William Leo Hasbury did, man, is create these organizations to kind of rebuild Africa. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's fascinating, man, that you had the descendants of formerly enslaved Africans had the vision to know that Africa would rise again and that the diaspora would actually play a huge role. And one of the reasons why African Americans are playing the leading role is because we're in the most powerful nation on the face of the globe. Mm-hmm. And we have access to resources. But these people have the vision, man, to understand that, you know what? We can actually help reshape Africa. And this is exactly what they're doing. These are the folks, man, who are helping to reshape the African continent. And the reason that they're doing it, man, is because unfortunately, most of Africa was colonized at this time. And again, they didn't have the human capital, the technological know-how, man, to kind of really, they actually needed assistance. And African Americans who, although oppressed in the United States, had the technical and educational know-how, man, to help transform the continent. And so it is happening. And it's happening in a huge way. So.
We appreciate that, Professor Davis. Now, Professor Davis, go ahead and, close out, tell people how they, let me ask this question. So last one, I promise, Professor Davis, I promise. As you answer this question, you can go ahead and give people your contact information, close out, sure. Talk about your book or whatnot. Now, I've read several articles, one dealing with how Black people in Boston, their net worth is like $5. Sure. Another one saying how Black America is just getting poorer by the day. I'm serious. These articles they put out. Sure. I used to live in LA. LA has the highest homeless population in America, and on Skid Row, which is worse than the worst thing I ever seen in my life as far as human conditions. 85% of those people are Black. What would be your response to this? Are we really doing that bad, or let me just say this, man, out as you answer that.
You know what? There are 50 plus million Black people in the United States, man. And are there poor people in the United States? Absolutely. I mean, think about it, man. You've had a population of people that were formerly enslaved and went through Jim Crow, etc. And so there's some negative impact with that. However, with that said, at the same time, man, you have some of the wealthiest, African Americans in the United States. And I'm not talking about professional athletes or entertainers and these types of people. I'm talking about the folks who have had money for the last 200 years. And so, I mean, when you speak of Black America, there are many, or there are multiple African American communities, man. I, I live on the East Coast where I live in one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, where I mean, really, where kids are driving Mercedes to school, they're going to Harvard, Yale. I mean, all of this, and so it really depends, man, in terms of that. Yes, there's always going to be poor people. I mean, there are poor people in Appalachia, there are poor people in East LA. There are poor Asian Americans. Some of the poorest Chinese live in Chinatown in New York, and so this is. I mean, this is just also a part of American life. The poor people, but at the same time, man, there are many African Americans. I mean, a lot of them that are quite wealthy, and I'm not talking about just first generation. I'm talking about generational wealth, man, going back, my God, to the 1840s, 50s, people who've actually had money. And so, yes, I'm not surprised that you see a disproportionate number of people who are poor in parts of California that are Black. African Americans have had a completely different history than the other groups in this country. And so, therefore, you're going to see probably a disproportionate number of folks who are struggling.
Okay. Now go ahead and close out, give everybody your contact information. And also, if you want to speak on your book as well, if you want to, it's up to you.
Right. Well, I am re-editing two books that I've done. One is on the history of the African American narrative. And the second book that I've done, it's on blackbirding. Are you familiar with the term blackbirding?
I'm not, no.
Well, blackbirding is the Pacific Island slave trade. Just to share this bit of information with you, is that after the Civil War in the 1960s, some of the Southerners wanted to continue the cotton plantation, and so they left America and they went to Australia, and they kidnapped South Sea Islanders or people or Melanesians. They kidnapped roughly 60,000 South Sea Islanders, and South Sea Islanders looked exactly like Blacks from Africa, and they brought these Blacks from Fiji, from Vanuatu, etc., to New South Wales and Queensland, Australia, and basically they enslaved them for roughly 60, 70 years. And so I'm talking about the legacy of of the Pacific Island slave trade in my second book, and most people are surprised to find out that there was a Pacific Island slave trade in the late 1860s through roughly 1906. And if you go to New South Wales, Australia, and also Queensland, Australia, you will find the descendants of people from Vanuatu, from Fiji, etc. And those were the people who were kidnapped off those islands and brought there by whites to work in the sugar fields of Australia in the 1860s through like 1906. If you want to contact me and speak more about this, you can reach me via email at Davis, D-A-V-I-S, L as in Larry, N as in Nancy, at 20750 @yahoo.com. And we can discuss my books and some of the other additional research that I am doing.
All right, perfect. All right, everybody. Anti-Gravity says you keep dropping that knowledge. Like I said, everybody appreciates your information. I mean, I do as well. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I will be right back on with Black Excellence here in about 2 minutes. So thank you for joining us, everybody. I appreciate it. Make sure you go to searchforhuru.com, go to dynastymirror.com, go to amazon.com, search your name, Dynasty Mirror, please buy a book. Also, make sure if you're new to this platform, please like, share, and subscribe. And then also like and share and follow on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Tag name is Search for Uhuru. Again, everybody, I appreciate it. Professor Davis, thank you so much. Till next time. Peace.
Oh,
now, go ahead.
Welcome. You're welcome, sir. Take care now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks so much.
And
Right.
I'll be in DC in 3 weeks, so we need to get together.
Absolutely, absolutely, sir.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.